Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Tonight's stories were all written back in 2008 by Joseph K. aka Cameron Suey, who is one of the board's few success stories as he went on to write Star Wars: The Force Unleashed and the Tomb Raider reboot.
There was a time when I believed running might help. If I could pack up my few belongings and burn the rest under cover of darkness and flee, I could start over somewhere new. But in this bleak, frostbitten place, I admit to myself truly that I cannot outrun him, that I can never escape him. And should I slip into the warm embrace of doubt after an unnaturally long stretch of peaceful, empty days, he will be only too happy to remind me of this. There's almost nothing left he can take from me. The days before him are fading like an aged photograph now, a hazy yellow dream of stability and happiness with a long future of happy possibilities stretched ahead. Today, I am huddled in the eaves of a collapsing barn in the Yukon Territory, desperately trying to start a fire with sodden and rotting hay. The more I burn now, the less I have to use as a blanket. It is a delicate balance that I have not quite mastered. I hitchhiked across the border 2 months ago and have been making my way north steadily. Going any other direction than north is no longer an option. I do not know what I will do when I reach the Arctic Ocean. Perhaps continue across the sea ice, if it has not thinned to the point of breaking. What I cannot do, ever, is return to my life, to Seattle. I can never see my son again. It seems absurd to think that just less than a year ago, my life was unfractured, whole. The pieces of my life were trite and predictable. I was an insomniac and used to lie awake staring at the ceiling, chewing over my doubts and secret fears, that I may not be able to keep up house payments, that I may not love my wife any longer, that I would repeat my father's failures with my son. These phantoms of doubt and fear filled my bleeding stomach with ragged holes that I recall now with almost fond nostalgia. How easy it all was then. The manila envelope was stuffed in the mail slot when I rose to prepare breakfast for my son. Unlabeled, unaddressed, only my name was written on it in jagged capitals. It contained one black VHS cassette, its label long ago faded and blurred. Over the top of the label was a black ink smiley face, blindly grinning up at me. It took me a day to find our VCR in the small attic crawl space, bundled with a few dozen home movies of our son's soccer games and birthday parties. Late at night, long after my family had drifted off to sleep, I connected it to our television. It whirred to life with a sharp smell of burning dust, and I inserted the tape. For a few moments, the static leapt and fizzled on the screen, then blackness. The silent image began to brighten to a washed-out shot of an elementary school parking lot at the start of day, and the picture zoomed into a small group of children among the chaos, and I recognized my son and a few of his friends. I began to wonder if I had accidentally retrieved one of our old tapes when, almost as an answer, the camera tilted forward into the inside of a car. The zoom lens racked forward on a crisp copy of the Times and lingered momentarily on the date. 2 days prior. My guts curdled with unease as the screen again went dark. A few seconds later, letters appeared, the bright and jagged electronic font of cheap in-camera titles. You can't save him. My insides gut turned to ice water and I slumped in the couch, my limbs feeling distant and useless. The letters vanished in a gust of static. I did not tell my wife, and certainly never told my son, but I drove to the police station in the morning. The heavy, oppressive dread of the night before had somewhat dissipated as I handed over the tape to the jowly and half-asleep officer and answered a few mumbled questions. He registered my concern with condescending impatience, and I eventually had to clasp my jaw and walk out quietly when I realized he would never view it as anything but a harmless prank. 2 days later, with the unease in my stomach waning little, I received another tape adorned with the same grinning cartoon. The image that this time resolved out of the static was a hallway, painted in night vision and gloom. The unseen cameraman walked slowly forward towards the last door. A little sigh of relief bubbled up in me, when I could not recognize the doors and windowless walls. This was someone else's house. The camera tilted down to see a gloved hand twist the doorknob. The only sound in the air was the clacking spin of the VCR heads and the tape's reels. The door opened to reveal a small and cramped bedroom and a dark, huddled form on the bed. The camera approached the form and a sleeping face soon filled the screen. It teased me with familiarity, tantalizingly close, but I could not yet recognize the face. Two objects dropped down onto the man's chest, thudding slightly and rousing him from his sleep. The first, a policeman's badge, all I need in a flash of recognition to connect this slowly stirring form with the desk sergeant. The second sealed his identity. It was the first tape. The crude, smiley face pointed perfectly upright. The policeman blinked twice and then squinted into the camera. In the few frames before blackness, I could see the brief impression of a flash, and a symmetrical flower of blood and bone erupt from his skull, just a brief flicker of streaking colors and light. I moaned pathetically in the darkness, an animal whimper of helplessness. Like a bolt of lightning, the jagged text lit up the screen. Your fault. I did not move until the pale light of morning, first letting the tape play out through a further hour of static, and then later sobbing silently under the cold blue light of the idling VCR. After a few hours of that quiet delirium, doubting what I had just seen, I rewound the tape and started it again. It was blank. Finding a set of small screwdrivers, I dismantled the tape and gingerly separated its carapace. Inside was a small magnet, ingeniously placed on a loose spindle inside the right spool of tape. The tape was erased the moment I watched it. Taped firmly to the side of the black plastic housing was a small, folded photograph. It was my wife and son, walking hand in hand out the front door of the house. On the back of the photograph, in the same blocky script as the envelope, were 3 letters and 3 sharp periods. SHH. There were times in the following year when I believed that only taking my own life would save my family. He never told me what, if anything, he wanted. He never revealed himself or his reasons. He seemed only content to watch the engine of my life shudder to a halt. I descended into a fog of self-pity and utter horror as all my relationships dissolved around me. At irregular intervals, always just enough time passed to make me believe that it had ended, that I had dreamt it all, I would receive a package. They each contained a half a dozen photographs on glossy paper. My son in school, doodling in his notebooks, shot through an open window. A soccer game, his leg frozen in mid-swing. A front yard game with 2 neighbors, my son suspended in a leap, his tongue stuck out in a mask of joy. I received the last package a month after my wife had left me. Unable to cope with my stony, hollow-eyed silence and slow-motion disintegration, she had returned across the state line to Idaho and her mother's house, where she made unsubtle attempts over nightly phone calls to convince our son to join her. Whatever amiability there was between us was flaking away like old paint, and I knew a court intervention was imminent. For myself, I did not know if I could keep my son safest close to me, or whether I was dooming him by my presence. He was increasingly distant, angry at my sudden shift in personality and inability to make his mother happy. His presence, no matter how he pouted and hid, was the one bright and shining point of that time, a silver thread to hold onto in the maelstrom. The week of the last package, he had taken a Greyhound bus to see his mother, already hinting at a desire to stay and live with her. I was in a black and foul mood when I found the familiar manila envelope in the entryway. It contained a single photograph and the first video I had gotten since the policeman's murder. The photograph was of my son, sleeping, in his bed at home. I held it in my hand, clutching tight and staring, not wanting to comprehend what I was seeing and its sickening implications. On the video, the smiley face was gone, and its place was a clock. I slid it into the VCR in a state of cold shock and sat at the edge of the couch, my eyes watering and my jaw hanging slack. It is time. You can keep him safe. The jagged letters crashed through the static and captured my gaze. Frozen in place, my lungs would not expand and my vision swam dizzyingly. The letters vanished and there was blackness again, but only momentarily, as a burst of cold light brought a new sentence to the screen. Go. The ashtray impacted with the center of the screen, and the television tube made an audible popping sound as glass and circuitry spilled from the wound. I hadn't even been aware that I was throwing the heavy pewter dish, but now I felt a hot wash of anger. The helplessness and fear of the last year flared in me. I would leave, I told myself. I would leave tonight and tell no one. If one good thing came from my miserable shipwreck of a life, I would keep my son safe, and I couldn't do that in the sorry state I was in. It seemed so obvious then, with sudden clarity. Of course he was not interested in my son. It was me he had been torturing all these months. If he hated me this much, enough to slowly break me, utterly and deliberately, then he would follow me like a hunter to prey wherever I went. So I would go. I almost made it out that night, but doubt ate away at my resolve as I packed a few bags, and I soon succumbed to a rare desire for sleep. In the warm cocoon of blankets, the idea of recklessly fleeing seemed so rash and foolish, and I knew that a new day would bring clarity and level-headedness. I awoke to the golden light of dawn streaming into my bedroom onto a scene of unfathomable violence. Blood and drying viscera coated the walls in uneven splatters. The sharp copper tang in the air shook me like smelling salts to damnable clarity. The carpet was soaked and spotted with crimson, thick puddles of blood glistening in the morning sunlight. In the far corner, where the walls were painted nearly black and the carpet invisible beneath a tiny lake of blood, was the body. The diminutive limbs were dark and smeared, stacked like cordwood. 2 slender arms and 2 legs capped with a pair of small curled hands and 2 feet, so smeared in gore that I mistook them for shoes. Beside the little pile of spindly limbs was a torso. Momentarily, I could not comprehend that this was part of the body, so surreal in its isolation and stillness. In the farthest corner at the apex of the slaughter was the broken television on a small table, the screen fully shattered to reveal a small interior space. Inside this hollow of plastic and metal was a head, balancing gracefully on its ragged neck and faced away from me. It was a long time before I moved, longer still before I ceased sobbing and walked on sodden carpet and wobbling knees towards the television. I prayed that I would not see my son's birthmark and scars on the limbs, and I held my gaze straight ahead as I approached the grotesque altar. Was that my son's hair? Was it ever so black, or is that just the light? I reached out slowly with both hands to gently cup the small head. I was empty now, the morning breeze blowing straight through my shell. All I had to do was turn to see my son's face, to know that I had failed him utterly, and then I would dry out like a husk and drift away in the wind. It was light in my hands and still ever so slightly warm. I slowly spun it to face me, angry at myself for not knowing by heart the sight of my son's ears or in jawline well enough to stop now, to prevent the inevitable rotation. The eyes were mercifully closed, but the cheeks were slit wide and high, in grim mockery of a smile. In his mouth, jammed far back and between the ragged slices of his face, was a videotape. A wave of pure, undiluted relief was followed by a sharp pang of guilt. This was not my son. I recognized the boy behind the curtain of blood, a friend of my son, yes, but this was not my son. Obediently, like in a trance, I took the video to the VCR, now connected to my son's tiny black and white set. With a wad of white paper towels, I had dried and cleaned the soiled cassette, and I now slid it into the machine and watched solemnly while the letters appeared. You can still save him. First, clean up. It dawned on me what he means and simultaneously why. I thought of the drying footprints of blood I've left around the house, my fingertips pressed against the corpse. I tried to imagine who might believe that I had slept through that act of unbridled cruelty, but seen and heard nothing. Now. I jerked with a start at this screen, as if the teacher had called my name and caught me daydreaming. I rose to my feet and stopped the tape. When I thought my son was dead, I believed that no pain could rend me worse. I now could see the foolishness of that. If he were truly gone, then I could not be hurt any worse, and in a way the man in the dark would have lost. But he lives. He lives for me to agonize over yet again, and this time, I don't have to wonder about the stakes. I have to do everything I can to keep him safe, I decided. This cannot happen to him. When I returned from the woods carrying a shovel wrapped in a thick canvas blanket from the truck, and leaving traces of dirt and clay, I began to pour the first gallon of gasoline on the bottom floor of my house. When the house was fully saturated, I returned to the VCR and its tiny monitor to watch the rest of the tape. I am a marionette now, dancing to a silent tune, free will no longer even a factor. The next sentence on the screen was familiar to me, though that was truly the first time I read it. I recognized it by the shape and outline of the letters. It was beneath the ashtray a split second before the impact. Go north. I was puzzled for a moment, a little resurgence of the self at this oddly vague and cryptic instruction. Just a direction and a command. I wondered where he meant for me to go, and how. Go now, you will know. And the tape ended, and I went. An hour later, a plume of smoke was visible to the south, fast receding behind the truck. I drove as far as the truck would take me, until it lost traction on the ice somewhere in British Columbia, and ended up with a broken axle in a roadside culvert. From there, I walked. My wife shut access to my bank accounts weeks ago, and the small amount of cash that I still carried has long since vanished. It's been a month so far, homeless and trudging like a sentinel through the darkest of winter. The snow and ice bring me comfort, the silent purity of the ground against the noonday sky, white on white. My life is only a direction now, and that anodyne of simplicity has bled into the land. When I cannot find a house to beg shelter in, or a barn to break into, I build small covered trenches in the snow and wrap myself in my tarp and blankets. This is more and more frequent as I travel northward, and as my clothes begin to stink and mark me as a transient. During the day, I walk. In the dark, I sleep. I sleep. Long and blissfully hours of oblivion come to with an ease I haven't had since childhood, and I wake fully rested each day. I am never alone, of course. He is with me, as he always has been. When the last of the money was gone, the pangs of hunger only lasted a day. The next morning, outside my small snow shelter, a pair of white rabbits lay stretched across the snow, only the red of their blood picking out their outlines on the snow. During that past year in the fog of his nightmares, I never even considered who he might be. I never cataloged which clients might have secretly loathed me, or which elementary school victim of my bullying now wished me dead. I wonder now, how willful was this ignorance? The sunlight is warm and unexpected on my face when I exit the barn the next morning, coat speckled with straw. It's a few miles to the next town, and I can make it time to beg for some breakfast and supplies for the next vacant stretch. I call my son from each payphone I pass, direct to his mobile, and listen to him get increasingly frustrated when I say nothing. Hearing him angry and alive is everything I need to keep going. My son is safe now that I've left him. As I believed he would, but for all the wrong reasons, the hunter, the man in the dark, has followed me here. He is no longer a danger to my family, and he can take nothing more from me now. He is happy now, because we are going north, and so am I, because I know at last and truly that I have saved my son. The cost is the pittance of my own life, and I now understand. I am grateful to give it to him. I am thankful to be a pack horse to this monster, carrying us both onward. I do not know what he wants for us here at the top of the world, but I know when the time comes he will make it known. So until then, I will go north.
September 2nd, 1868. Arrived in Cheyenne in the new Wyoming Territory early this morning on the new Union Pacific Line. Has been 3 years since I rode the locomotive. Did not realize it would remind me so strongly of Atlanta. Spent the last day of the journey with the phantom smell of blood and iron in my nostrils, and the bile rising at the back of my throat, but it is over. God willing, I will never have to ride the train again. Cheyenne is newborn and mewling like a babe. Immigrants from the east and across the seas teem here, filling the streets with a babble of tongues and the raucous laughter of drunken, listless youths. The hound I purchased before leaving tugs at his leash with delight at the sights and sound. The plot of land is still 2 days' ride across the border and to the southwest, but true to his word, the man from the bank has hired a guide to take me there. Sent a last letter to my wife and boys with instructions to meet me here in the spring, and have purchased a wagon and the supplies for construction. The guide, a half-Indian fellow I'd wager by appearance, but civilized in tongue, has helped me hire 2 young men. An Irishman with a sullen, chinless face, and a German, watery-eyed and stinking of bourbon. Both despicable wretches, but they have agreed to work for a pittance, and both claim to have experience in homesteading. They may intend to kill me, seeing an easy mark in a naive settler, but I do not fear these drunken children. I've seen a generation of these boys spilled open, and I know what they are made of. September 8, 1868. Have crossed into the free territory of Colorado after a day of the level prairie of warm wind of Wyoming into the Front Range. This land is wild in some strange way, and like nothing I've ever seen. We are following a river through the shadow of two jagged peaks and camped tonight just a few miles from the parcel of land. I requested remote, and by God the bankman did not fail me. The Kraut and the Irishman grow demure and quiet without spirits, and I see no possibility of violence in them now, lest they suspect me of hoarding whiskey. They will do fine, quick labor and return to Cheyenne to drink and fuck the profits. These are men of dust and serve only this purpose: to think good men like me fought and died to protect these jackals from the reach of Lincoln's tyranny. God grind his bones. I will be free of that monster soon, and if it should spread its federal borders this far, then I will burn my new home to the ground and move west yet again. Sons of bitches will have to push me into the sea before I swear fealty. Found a skull just off the deer trail when I went to make water. It was bleached white and divorced from the jawbone and neck. I try not to view this as a portent. Tomorrow we should reach the plot and begin. September 9th, 1868. The bankman has lied to me, the foul stuffed pig. The plot of land clearly identified by compass and map is not the idyllic grove his words painted, but a swamp. A sodden hollow filled with mud and grass, ringed with broken and dying pines. I would flay my guide alive if I thought his wretch of an employer might feel a sting. Am determined to homestead here, however. This may not be the land I desired, but it is mine, by God. The Irishman and the German fell trees for me, and I have found the highest place, where the earth is damp the least. I will tame this land. The hound does not like it here. He growls at the horizon and pads in small, tight circles, looking always behind him. September 10th, 1868. Guide has vanished in the night. He was to spend the next few days properly mapping the borders of my land, but he has fled. Worse still, the Irishman and the Kraut have grown skittish at his departure. The German tells a tale of hearing screaming in the woods last night. But in the morning light, the guide's tent and belongings were packed away and gone. It shames me to admit, but my first night was filled with unease. There is something about this land, unlike any in the East. It seems to breathe and pulse around me, like it watches me with a cold intelligence. The trees sing softly in the breeze, and in the smallest hours, when sleep had fled into the dark, I fancied I heard whispering voices in the breeze. I will share none of this with the laborers. They are weak and callow enough as it is. If superstition infects them, I will be left alone here while they flee. September 14th. My hands bleed at the end of each day. I drive the boys hard, but myself harder. The skeleton of the cabin is complete now, but there is much more work to do. I do not think they have the stomach for real work, these dogs. They slow, now that they see the rough outline, believing their work is at an end. I suppose a pig may recognize a barn by sight, but we would hope too much to think they understand a crossbeam and a proper roof. My dread in the nights has deepened to a level I scarcely am willing to accept. In the ebon black of the night, I am an immigrant from a dead land into one that lives yet. Each creak of the trees seems to come from my own shuddering spine. While I hear no birds or beasts during the day, a fact that only now seems to have pertinent, the night is alive with the rustle in the bush. Occasionally, I hear the crashing stomp of one of the drunkards slogging to the tree line to void his bladder. The boys have indeed brought out a stash of bottles, and they have taken to drinking themselves into a stupor each night, rationing the stuff to fend off the night. I won't speak of it to the likes of them, but I know they share my unease. Their eyes are hollow each morning, and I catch them whipping around to look wide-eyed into the trees as if they'd seen their deaths coming on padded feet. I've taken to leashing the hound at the edge of the clearing. He whimpers and shudders throughout the night, and when he wakes, he howls and barks at the sky. If he cannot make himself useful when the need to hunt arises, I will put a bullet in his noisy skull. September 15th. The German is gone. I suspected at first that he had turned his tail up back to Cheyenne. I was wise not to pay him up front. His companion, sick with fear and delusion, entered the cabin and shook me awake to tell me that he had been carried off in the night, same as our guide. I boxed his ears and dragged him to their camp, whereas I suspected his belongings were gone, but the wretch refused to work until we'd looked for his partner. Combed the woods all day with no sign of the German. Some of the night's alien gloom lingers in the woods throughout the day, and I must confess, leaping at the smallest noises. The hound, finding his purpose again, tracked the German's trail, only to find that it looped around the grove several times, spiraling outward from the cabin. The trail soon vanished, and the hound began to strain at the leash, pleading for me to return him to the safety of our clearing. With the cabin in sight, at the edge of the trees, I made an unsettling discovery. At twice the level of a man's height, a canvas rucksack hung from the dead branches of a massive gray and rotting pine. More unsettling, when I opened the satchel, I found the clothes of a much shorter man than I had expected. This was our guide's bag. I will not tell the poor fear-crazed Irishman when he returns. To credit his bravery, he still remains in the woods as night falls. I hear him shouting his companion's name as he follows the spiraling trail with no end. He is a fool, but braver than I believed. The dark has swept over the land like the sackcloth of Revelations, and there is ice in my blood. I can no longer hear the Irishman now, the sounds of the night, the still unfamiliar tapestry of living bodies and the creak of the towering pines drown out his cries. I feel foolish, but I fear for his safety. September 16th. Woke in the moonless night to the sounds of screaming, far in the distance. A whimpering, tearing shriek that stilled even the noises of the dark. I laid, unable to move in the bedroll on the wooden floor, unsure for a time if I had ever actually left the battlefield hospital of Atlanta and waiting for cannon and musket fire. But it was only the one lone boy, screaming in the dark, and I was helpless to save him. I clutched the rifle close, and the hound lay shivering at my side. The boy screamed, his voice coming from every direction over the course of several hours before it dissipated into a soft whimper. We could do little but wait for daybreak. In the light of day, I forced the hound back into the maw of the woods. I feel like wilting and crying each time I contemplate leaving the swampy ring of trees, but even an Irishman deserves a cursory search. I found him near dusk. After following a now familiar spiraling trail, I reached the unnatural giant tree that once held the guide's belongings. It was fresh, marked with jagged, irregular cuts that exposed the rotting heartwood beneath. The cuts went high up into the boughs, and I had to strain my eyes to see, but what I finally made out made me suddenly ill. The boy lay cradled in two high branches, with his limbs dangling and cracked in a dozen false joints. His head was twisted, like he sought to imitate an owl, completely behind him. One glassy eye stretched wide next to an empty socket, and his tongue lolled from his frozen jaw. He is owed a Christian burial, even a papist such as him, but I will need to fell the tree to fetch his body. I wish I had the strength and will to do it now, but the night of lost rest before, and the day's gruesome business robs me of the desire for much besides sleep. September 17th. I am leaving this place. I lost all that I own, but if I leave in a few hours with the safety of the dawn, I leave with my life. I will see my wife and boys again. Woke this morning to a flinty gray dawn that never turned blue, but only drizzled a thin vapor of rain. The idea that I ever could have dreamed of living here sickens me now. I sat all day on the porch of the house, the very ground of the meadow looking threatening. The jagged teeth of the trees against the gray sky and the lapping of the puddled water in the wind gave me the uncanny feeling of being inside a gargantuan maw that has been closing down on me since the moment I arrived. I was still determined then to reclaim this land, to fill the bog and fell the trees and make the fertile black soil work under my plow. How foolish now. With the fall of night came a whipping wind, buffeting me with heavy, damp air. When the last thread of light had been cut, the hound stood to his feet and strained against the leash, hair on end and teeth bared. He strained on the leather leash that held him and began to growl, a low menacing sound. I looked to where he struggled to lunge, but could see nothing in, no horizon between ground and forest, or forest and sky, just blackness. When the leash broke, it made a popping sound, like a firecracker, and the hound bolted into the black. I heard the angry rhythm of his barking as he was absorbed into the dark. Then it ceased, and I heard a sharp squeal. Then silence. The crowding throng of life that I had felt each night before was utterly silent. The only sound, the dry rustle of the pine. I shouldered the rifle and fired once into the dark, and my skin rippled as my insides froze. In the bright flash of the rifle, I saw a phantom impression of the world inside the gloom, pale trees and wet earth. And I saw clearly the corpse of the hound, wet and glistening. Beside it was the shape of some foul thing. Crouched on crooked legs like the limbs of some beast, it held some dark portion of the dog in its splayed fingers. It was upright and looking straight at me. All I saw of its face was the bright diamond glint of two eyes and teeth. So many teeth. The gunshot rolled down the valley in darkness, and I heard no movement from the blackness beyond. With all the speed I could muster, I fled for the cabin and barricaded the door with every crate and unused hearthstone I could find. Gripping the rifle tight, I did my best to lay perfectly silently and swore to leave at first light. When sleep finally came, it was fitful, and I awoke only a few hours later to a strange pinprick burning on my neck. I came awake to find a head, perched like a trophy at the top of the barricade, which yet lay intact and undisturbed. Around me were the hellish tracks of some beast, wet mud shapes that defied identifications. I put my hand to my throat and felt a line of small drops across it. Blood welling up from a delicate scratch that ran from ear to ear. The room was empty and still fortified from within, but it had been here with me moments before. It had marked me, toyed with me, and left. And so, at first light, I will leave. September 18th. I am 10 miles from the cabin, and I curse myself for a fool. With the morning sun, the meadow steamed and felt somehow safer, but still I packed my lightest valuable tools and left the cabin. 5 miles down the road, doubt set in. I have stopped to eat on this small bluff looking out at the glory of God's creation, and I have made up my mind. Reading yesterday's entry flushes me with shame. What a coward I was. Whatever that thing is, it's a beast, and I am a soldier. I will hunt it, trap it, and kill it. What God and Grant could not grind out of me, I will not relinquish to some wild animal. I will not leave my wife and sons paupers. I will be a man. I will return. June 29, 1869, Mrs. Augustine Shelby, Grand Hotel, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Dear Mrs. Shelby, we recently received the enclosure from a pair of hunters who discovered it in forests of the Front Range in Colorado Territory. Having been made privy to the issue of your missing husband, we felt it was best to inform you directly and pass on his journal and a few other possessions. The hunters described the area in which they found the items in a way that agrees exactly with your husband's description in the journal, but there was no cabin, nor foundation, or any other signs of habitation. We are deeply sorry that we could not be of more assistance to you, and I pray that your husband will eventually be found. Deepest regrets. Colonel Benjamin Williams, Fort Collins, Colorado Territory.
It's been a long time since I've seen the storm. It's always been there behind us, whispering through the shuddering ground. A background roar behind the wind. We'd been ahead for so long, moving slightly faster than its clockwork crawl, until the mountains. Then, as we ground ourselves upward against these slopes, we heard it rumbling closer, a rising quake in the earth. But it's been a while since I turned around and actually saw it. Sitting here on the side of the mountain in the frigid morning, it fills my vision and stings my eyes with the monstrous unreality of it. It rises like an unbroken wall into the sky, obscured only by the limits of my sight, fading into the clear blue and stretching away north and south, curving away with the earth. The sunlight doesn't seem to touch it. Nothing does. At the ground, where the churning wall of sickly blue lightning and black clouds grinds across the earth, I can see the unmaking. The lower peaks, already shaking apart, burst and ablate away at the event horizon of the storm. The land dips before the onslaught, as if shying away from the kiss of the boiling wall. I can feel the violence beneath my feet as millions of tons of ancient mountain falls away into its infinite maw. It's going to be on me in a few hours. I wonder if I'll die when the peak caves away, crushed in a free fall of slate and stone, or whether I'll be alive when the storm touches me, shredded and atomized, erased and unmade. I wonder again what it might feel like. The joints in my legs wail as I stand myself up from the sharp rocks, and my left ankle cries in agony as the bruised bones click. I turn my back on the storm and look forward at the last mile of road, curving up into the pass. I start to walk, moving east along the wind-weathered pavement, feeling the rising vibrations of the storm in each step. As it rocks my grinding ankle, I think about the state fair in summer, a decade ago, and a machine with a footplate that vibrated for a quarter. I think about the wonderful, almost unpleasant intensity of the sensation. I hold on to this memory, working it in my mind like a lump of sugar until I have savored all I can from it. The wind is on my face, as even the air seems to be rushing away toward the wall. I'll be walking when it comes, still moving, just not quite fast enough in the end. But I can make it to the top. Not for the first time I reel to think it's only been a month since the lights first went out. Nearly a month ago I was riding a bus, on a Wednesday, back when such a thing mattered. I remember the feel of it, as the end of the world passed over us, a quiet sigh rippling through the air. The engine stalled, and the lights flickered out, but there was no panic. My fellow dozen passengers remained quiet, and we waited silently for the inevitable restart of the engine. I stared out the windows, and after too long a moment, it dawned on me that every light across the street was out as well. Then we heard the distant explosions, popping in the distance, like faraway fireworks. Some of us began to panic then. We clawed our way out the back doors of the bus and poured out into a mercifully cool July evening. The stars were shining with an intensity that scared me more than the explosions, bitter and cold. We all spent a moment intent on phones and handsets that didn't work, wouldn't turn back on before sliding them away to be forgotten. Forever. Something streaked overhead towards the west. Noiselessly, leaving a smoking trail thrown into sharp relief by its brilliance, a roaring fireball passed over us and disappeared beyond the horizon. A few moments later, a tinny rumble rolled back across the valley. The bus driver stopped trying to restart the engine and joined the knot of riders, gathered close and struck mute by the quiet, strange way that the world had just changed. Shooting stars streaked steadily above like a meteor shower coming too early in the year. For 10 minutes we stood quiet as the explosions began to lessen. When the only sound left was our nervous breath and the baying of dogs, someone made a joke I don't now recall, but we laughed like children passing a graveyard, nervous and harsh. We walked home, strangers sharing names we hadn't bothered to on the bus, names I could not remember the next day. I turned away towards my apartment, and I never saw any of them again. I imagine in suburbs across the small town, neighbors were standing on their porches and front lawns in robes and slippers with dim and dead flashlights in hand, trading theories and comforting each other. But the apartment complex I'd landed in when I'd moved out of Gail's house was quiet and dark. Not even the emergency lights were on as I took a long, slow time fumbling through the dark halls and into the cave of my studio. I desperately wanted to talk to someone, to share information to try to make sense of what had happened. The complete loss of electricity seemed to point to a nuclear detonation, but the explosion seemed so distant and somehow too small to be the old boogeyman of my parents' generation. This all seemed indescribably stranger. In the light of the day, it got stranger still. There was an almost pleasant shift in the community, as walkers ferried information from neighborhood to neighborhood, certainly much of it distorted, but much of it unmistakably true. Batteries didn't have a charge, anywhere. Pacemakers had stopped. Everything with an electric current had failed. Fire had trouble starting. It wasn't colder, but nothing wanted to burn. Lighters worked only rarely, and their flames were weak and anemic. We made great bonfires to test this strange new truth, and with some effort they lit, flickering low and blue, but fundamentally wrong. On the second day, from a man on a bicycle, we got the explanation for the first night's explosions. Airplanes gliding downward, dead and dark, impacting across the valley and beyond. The falling stars had been satellites, he said, the whole network simply dropping from the sky. It was like some essential measure of energy had been withdrawn from the world. Some internal engine of the universe was winding down, and that scared me far more than nukes. None of us knew what to do. We ate the food we had before it spoiled, and stores were empty by the second day. Most everything sold for cash only. In some last defiant show of togetherness, prices stayed flat in almost all the stores, and I traded what little currency I had for several crates of bottled water. We were planning on waiting it out. We didn't understand that this was not an interruption, but a terminus. It was rumored at first by the end of the first week. Ragged and tired people drifted through town in search of water and food, and bearing wide-eyed apocalyptic warnings. They told of mass exodus, a mad flood of people streaming away from the western coastline. Conflicted, terrifying stories told in whisper of the storm. None of the first refugees had seen it firsthand, but what they had learned had scared them bad enough to start heading inland. In those first days of flight, the human tide followed the major highways, and our small town only got the odd stragglers, those fleeing not only the fabled storm, but the rivers of atrocity the refugee march had become. We had no way of knowing if it was just amplification of nightmare rumors, or if the interstates heading east really had become a vast trampling ground, where urban populations surged inland without plan or recourse, shredding and churning against one another, fleeing away from the coast and the storm. People in town started to disappear in the next few days, spooked enough by the mad tales to start their own exodus and to avoid the main highways. My own feet felt light, but I waited, held off until the last wave. They were wild and glassy-eyed, the last refugees, the ones who had waited like me in small towns further west. They had seen the surging sea of refugees, seen the corpse trails they left, had heard of the storm that had made landfall at last, but they had waited, holding out hope that this was only a temporary insanity. But then they saw the storm with their own eyes, and it was a testament to the madness of it that the eyewitnesses' stories were more fevered and impossible than the second-hand rumors that preceded them. I was packed ready to go, the last of my water tucked in with a camp stove and a sleeping bag and a backpack when the last wave came, but I didn't leave yet. I waited one more day until I saw it for myself. It came up over the western horizon with the dawn, as if rising to challenge the sun in the east, swallowing all light. Over the course of 3 hours, I watched it unmake the foothills, swallowing earth, forest, and river. The world rose up and away, seeking oblivion like a lover, vanishing forever into the churning wall of impossible madness, leaving only bursts of blue lightning arcing between the black clouds. Lightning, clouds, storm, these are imperfect metaphors. The storm of the unmaking isn't a storm. It isn't made up of the things storms are made up of. There are no clouds, no lightning, only seething darkness and jagged energy. I'm not even sure now, even as it polishes the earth away behind me, if you even can see it. Maybe our brains fill in ghosts of some recognizable structures over the pure unreality of the storm. Maybe it looks only like the nothing that it is, and we simply cannot accept this. Tucker used to say to his followers, when the lines began to be drawn, that it was the mouth of God, that someday we could accept it, and we would see through the black veil of the storm and see the divine feast for what it really was. When there was only the open valley between me and the storm, I fled my home, heels pounding on country roads until I reached the refugees of the last wave, somewhere in the Central Valley. And it's with that small band of stubborn fools, the ones who had waited until they too had seen the storm, that I traveled for the last 3 weeks. Tucker was there, quiet at first, shaken by the loss of someone he loved on the charnel highways, but then there were no leaders. We shared supplies, gathering canned goods at country gas stations and parceling them out amongst us all. We outpaced the storm in the day, spent short quiet nights laughing around the pitiful campfire, awakening always with the storm on the horizon. Each day we pulled ahead of it, following the untrails of the refugees ahead of us, always turning away from the spoor of abandoned belongings and the fly-choked corpses. This way, we found the untapped stores and caches, the things people left behind. We were frightfully inefficient in those early days, but we did more than just survive, and it gave us hope. Then we washed into the foothills, and we slowed. We had built up a lead on the storm, had had a few mornings now where we hadn't seen it on the horizon, only felt the low bass notes of its presence. That little hope and good cheer we had built up in our advance evaporated, like the earth before the storm. 2 nights into the steady uphill climb, a dented can of soup made 3 of us ill. We lingered for too long in the morning as they emptied their guts, and the storm crested the edge of the world. A quiet sort of panic gripped us all, and we took to the country back roads again, driven by the fresh reminder of the encroaching end. Tucker drove us on, moving faster than before, and when the 3 sickened members of our troop lagged behind, Tucker called to them that we would go ahead. They should take their time, and we would make camp for them up ahead and wait before leaving. No one believed the lie, but we all played our part, even the dead men, with patient nods and glassy eyes. They never arrived that night, and we left even earlier than before. Tucker kept us moving, and the group began turning toward him. We all wanted to leave the sick men behind, but Tucker had done it. In this passive act of consensual murder, most of us had turned our fate over to him willingly. By the end of another week, as we reached the base of the jagged mountains, Tucker began to carry less and less and ate more and more. But the mountains broke us. Our speed halved. The roads wound away from our direction, away from the rising sun, and no one had a map or remembered which pass through the mountains was the most direct. We were forced into the footsteps of the first great waves of refugees, and now the roadsides were choked with the sick and the dead. Rows and rows of naked blackened feet, picked clean of socks and shoes, stuck out from the roadside grass. I scavenged there, pulling a pair of boots from the feet of a prone man about my height, trying first to ignore his feeble, dying groans, then whispering my apologies to him as he gasped for breath. It was impossible to tell how many of the original refugees had made it this far, or had gone on up the mountains, but there was no food to be had in their trail, little water to be plundered. Tucker drove us on, and in the lower mountains he began to preach, simple little sermons of necessity and absolution for what we'd done and would do, and it drove the jagged wedge at last between the group. From a loose band of strangers with a common goal, we became Tucker's people and the others, and that divide grew cold and icy. I suppose the line was the same as the night we left the 3 sick men behind. There were those that couldn't sleep that night, and those that could. It would be easy and a filthy lie to draw a moral line in that split. We were all good men once. We all left them behind. No one objected. The divide between Tucker's people and the rest of us was a matter of who still had energy to feel guilt, and who had just enough to follow what they saw as their best and only hope. It was Tucker who was in charge of the supplies, of the nightly division of food. Before I realized what had happened, it was too late. Tucker's people held stubbornly to their health, and the rest of us began to wane. A little less water, a few less crucial calories. As the cold and the altitude made the journey harder, Tucker tightened his control on our bodies and we began to wither. We were all so profoundly tired that we couldn't even communicate our nascent paranoia to one another, until we began to drop away, falling behind while no one had the strength to look back. One by one, until near the top of the pass there was only Tucker's folk and I. They had already started sleeping apart from us, striking camp earlier and quieter. 2 nights ago, I awoke to find them 100 meters down the road, none of them looking back. I caught up with them and no words were exchanged, but Tucker caught my eye from the front, his body unladen, free, and frighteningly healthy. Last night, near the top of the pass, I couldn't sleep, as the chill terror of what I had allowed to happen coursed through me, twirling with the bitter cold of the mountain night. Tucker was awake as well, and sometime in the dark, he walked over to where I sat, my ragged camping mattress pressed to a rock in a crude chair. He sat beside me, his cold eyes reflecting colder starlight, and we said nothing. We hadn't spoken in nearly a week, and in truth, I think only Tucker had spoken for the last few days. Above us the night was silent, a sky devoid of planes, unblemished by the lights of man. In the distance, the storm must have been visible, but I had days ago stopped trying to see it. After what felt like an hour, Tucker sighed and slowly stood, staring down at me, a black silhouette against a cobalt sky. I think he may have smiled. It was hard to tell. He raised his foot and brought the heel down hard on my ankle, once and then again before I had the chance to scream. My cries woke no one, and Tucker walked back to his place in the warm center of the sleeping people. I wanted to stand, to go and bash his skull in, but as the sharp splinters of pain became a low, throbbing ache, I found no strength to stand, no will or capacity for murder, only at last the surrender of sleep. When I awoke this morning, they were gone, far over the pass. By my feet, someone had left 1 bottle of water and 1 tin of meat, nothing to live off of, but this token gesture of mute apology was all that allowed me to stand, all that got me to face the storm with any sort of dignity. And now I am walking towards the top of the pass, to look down over the other side before I die. In one hand is the water, and the other, the tin of meat, my backpack left somewhere below. I carry them like little talismans, one last reminder that we are not all Tucker, that we are all ourselves, even if none of that matters. I reach the top of the pass and start looking for a good place to die. I find something else, something that proves better than death. A trail of blood droplets on the pavement, leading to or from an alpine field of boulders. On either side of the blood droplets, I start to make out faint tire tracks in the stony gravel. The trail leads me to a tableau of bodies and blood spattered under the clear sky. I have seen many scenes of murder along the road, more as the waves of refugees funneled up these paths, but it's not what happened here that fills me with black joy, but what was left behind. Only the most foolhardy kept their carts and wagons with them when the road met the mountains. But here in the morning sunlight is an honest-to-God truck, an old yellow Datsun, more rust than metal. 3 of the tires are flattened, mere shreds of graying rubber around bent and pitted rims. At the front, lashed to the bumper, is the remains of a harness, where a team of horses were once hitched, having dragged the truck up and across the mountains only to die here. 3 of the horses are a few yards away, dragged from the truck to be butchered. Their carcasses are stripped clean, first by men and then by the vultures that dot the sky above every road I've traveled in the last month. In the back of the truck are the remains of a once great cache of water and food. All that remains now are a few torn and cracked plastic bladders, what invaluable liquid they once held long ago abandoned to the arid air. A few tins of food rest in one corner, cracked open as if by hammer blows. The truck bears many small wounds as well, evidence of the gunfight that killed the 2 men at my feet. In between the vultures' furrows, their death wounds read like scripture, declaring the changed nature of our dying world. Robbed of the full power of the focused force of combustion, bullets still are deadly. But instead of piercing, these shots pushed great shallow craters into their flesh. Both these men took many shots before they succumbed to their wounds. In the cab of the car lies what I can only assume was the once owner of this fortune. His chest flattened and shredded, his eyes staring and milky. His skin is not quite blackened like the others, and he bears only the one wound, grievous as it may be. In his hand, he still clutches the giant revolver that kept his killers at bay, as if still warding off attackers, even in death. Nearly dried pools of black blood lie sticky in the seat, evidence of a slow wounded death here on top of the mountain. The other killers must have waited for him to die, gambling precious time for the wealth of the truck and the horses. I take the gun from the driver, check to find 2 bullets remaining, and see in them 2 chances of taking back my destiny from the storm. For a minute, I am drunk on the idea of spitting into the unmaking as I send one slow bullet hammering into the thinnest part of my skull. I live this moment over and over again, even as I feel the ground shudder with the storm's approach. That's when I hear the frightened exhale and dry breath of the 4th horse. He's moved out from behind wherever he was hidden, and he stands 50 yards away, across the road, shredded ropes dangling from his twisted harness and bridle. He flicks his head towards me, and then to the oncoming wall of the storm, and stamps his feet with fear and frustration, eyes rolling back and showing white. I ignore the screaming in my ankle, don't even hear it after a dozen paces as I lope and vault towards the speckled gray beast. My sudden lurching approach seems to baffle him as much as the absurd horror approaching in the sky, and he manages to take a few panicked steps back, whinnying in terror before I reach him. I grab at the rope, miss, and then lunge forward again. He tries to rear up and away, but my fingers close on the frayed nylon cord and I close tight with a death grip. I can feel the layers of flesh on my palm abrading away as the horse screams uncomfortably like a woman and whips its head from side to side. I hold fast and scream right back at it, my eyes just as wild. I roar at the beast and it shrieks back, and I feel naked and alive in a way I can't ever recall. Close now, I hear a shuddering crack as the bones of the world fall away into the mouth of the storm, and I hold fast at my only chance to live. The horse is wasted, his ribs showing through tattered piebald hide, but he was once a massive beast. I curse and scream at him, and his struggling stops as he surrenders. Mounting the animal proves the hardest task of all. Even as he begins to submit to my will, it takes a great and painful effort to lunge and throw my body up and over his unsaddled back. I manage to drape myself across his spine, the protruding vertebrae pressing into my empty stomach. With some effort, thanks only to the beast's state of exhaustion, fear, and malnourishment, I throw my wounded leg up and over, and I rise into a hunched seated position, my bleeding hand still pulling tight on the bridle. I can see now from my perch on a dying horse, the world beginning to crumble at the edges, the event horizon of the unmaking as it eats, shreds ancient mountains like transient summer weeds, marching inexorably towards the top of the pass. Less than a mile away is God's maw, the slow chewing end of the world, and I dig my heels into protruding ribs and turn away to buy myself a little more time. Just a little more time. The horse needs little encouragement. We descend together the downhill side of the pass away from the storm. I stroke the tattered mane beneath my fingers, and am unsurprised to find myself crying as I whisper thanks to the animal. Soon we're moving at a steady trot, putting the peak behind us, and once again advancing away from the storm. I allow the horse to stop a few times as he sniffs out thin highland grasses and a few pools of melted snow. My tribe and every other refugee missed on the way down, and I even dismount to drink greedily from the standing water. In my parched haste, I drop the nylon rope, leaving behind a layer of skin and setting the horse free, but it waits for me. I'd like to attribute this to some sort of mutual survivor loyalty, but I see only empty eyes, already filming over as the overtaxed body begins to shut down. The horse carries me another 20 miles before it dies, but not before we pass my tribe. They look mutely up at me, the pistol tucked in my belt, some masks of fear, some lowering their eyes in guilt, but most simply look with flat faces, as if they expected me to return at any moment and are neither pleased nor surprised. I don't know what I in turn expected of them, but the reunion is as hollow as it is comforting. I bear them no ill will, and expect nothing from them beyond their essential human presence. I reserve one small smile for Tucker, all gritted teeth and bloodless gums, as I pass, and he keeps his expression blank and cool, but I see the flaring nostrils and the tremor at the corner of his lips. And then I ride on, leaving them behind for a short while to collect my thoughts and to turn away from the business of today's survival, to think about tomorrow's. A mile or so later, the horse falls to its knees, shudders slightly before toppling over. I'm thrown to the road and tumble without grace, skidding and rolling and slightly grateful that my people aren't here to see me go down. The horse breathes 4 last ragged breaths, and I whisper my thanks to glassy and clouding eyes. By the time my tribe catches up to me, near dark, I've started a weak fire from a mountain brush and am cutting away the stringy meat from the flanks of my horse. They come towards me, mouths watering at the spicy scent of concentrated blood splashing to the stones, and a few produce knives to take up the work of butchering. Tucker stands away from the knot of silent people, people that are no longer his. Arms limp at his sides, his body is unladen with supplies or water, naked and alone. There is no expression on his face, nor on mine as I approach him. Few of our tribe even turn to look. Most are too busy or too exhausted to care what is about to happen, and none of it will be a surprise, least of all to Tucker or myself. He nods to me, dipping his head to the ground for a long and quiet moment, before turning slightly to look backwards. We made good time on the downhill side, and only the churning clouds in the high atmosphere signal the presence of the storm. The ground no longer shudders. Once again, we've outpaced the storm by one more day. But you can still feel it, in the air and in your bones. I know that's where Tucker is looking. It holds his attention for a long time. He turns back, mouth parted as if to speak, and I fire the pistol. The weak popping sound of the shell seems to vanish instantly, but the fat, wide bullet cracks the center of Tucker's face like an iron fist. Everything caves inward towards the impact as the slow bullet dissipates its wan force across the delicate arches and filaments of his skull. He coughs as he falls, once from his ruined mouth, sending a fine mist of blood into the air. From the ground, he blinks his one remaining eye, looking straight up at nothing, and although I think about leaving him there, I kneel and press the barrel to his temple. His eye closes and he sighs, a strangely musical sound in the absolute quiet of the evening. Muffled, the second shot barely makes a sound beyond a wet thump. I pile a few rocks onto Tucker, making his cairn where he fell, and again a few of my tribe come to assist me. There is no guilt in me or the tribe. There is no malice in the murder and no hatred in its aftermath. It is simply a correction, a balancing of the sums, another step along a very long path. I take Tucker's boots, the high ankle serving as the basis for a simple brace made of nylon rope from the horse's bridle. When we are done, when the horse meat is dried and packed away, and we have slept through the silent night, we turn our backs to the burial and to the storm, and Tucker's name is never mentioned again. We move on. We keep walking. As we cross the arid highlands between the great spines of the country, we learn. Small towns still have food, and we learn to carry supplies efficiently, distributing the weight. Nearly every home has a gallon of fresh water in the back of each toilet, and plastic bottles in abundance. We learn to carry the perfect amounts of water from one stop to the next, maximizing our speed. Libraries have, among other things, books on edible plants, and we begin grazing, constantly pulling what meager calories we can. We carry less, we burn less energy, we walk farther. We become lean and long like gazelles tanned brown by the sun. The world is empty. We meet a few lone people who never saw the great waves of refugees, never knew what happened after the blackout, and we invite them with open arms and tell them of the storm. Not all come, not all believe the wild tales of these strange-eyed nomads, and we don't blame them, we simply walk on. It would seem many of the people of the heartland headed for the bigger cities when the lights went off, hoping for strength in numbers, or to bind their fate to organizations that had already crumbled. Every city is a perpetual pillar of smoke and a vast killing field. We give them a wide berth, ranging instead through the wide open fields, through the breadbasket of the country. We don't know what happened to the first refugee waves that came before us. The signs of their passing become harder to see. As they diminished and ate each other alive, maybe all that washed across the plains ahead of us were ragged ghosts, gibbering about the impossible storm. They don't matter anymore. Only our tribe matters, and we have learned to survive where they did not, and we have a long way yet to go. We have outpaced the storm so far ahead of it that it would take a full week for it to catch us, and this serves us well. We sleep better, we harden, and we travel faster. We plan. When we reach the ocean in the east sometime in the world's last autumn, when we can walk no further, we will need time to search. We have torn pages from books, and we study them obsessively, learning everything we can about the ocean, about boats and sailing. We will find whatever tall-masted vessels we can, and we will resume our eastward journey on the wind. We will go as far as we can until we reach land again. Failing that, we will wade into the waves and swim until the storm takes us.
He didn't write a South story, so here's a semi-recent one from an Anon. Here's some OC from the most terrifying haunting I've ever experienced. April of last year, deep south USA. Just moved into my new apartment, getting settled in, meeting neighbors, etc. Felt a weird presence in the air the first time I was alone in there, but didn't think too much of it. It's now my third night in the apartment. I'm trying to fall asleep. I have a fan on, but I can hear a strange ticking/mechanical sound coming from the hallway. I get a sense of dread and am reluctant to investigate, but I do anyways. Follow the sound to a door to a small pantry closet. It's nowhere near the water heater or AC unit. Shitting myself as the sound continues, and I decide to open the door. It's empty, and the sound immediately stops. WTF. Go back to bed and eventually sleep. A couple nights later, I'm in my bed sleeping. I have a vivid dream where I walk down the hallway, but I feel like something is lurking around the corner. I reach the end of the hallways, and this nasty creature, demonic, almost like the Donnie Darko bunny, jumps from behind the corner and screams at me. Wake up in a sweat. Stay up with the lights on the rest of the night. Nothing too strange happens for a while. I witness doors to my bedroom and bathroom slowly open and close at times, even if they were fully shut. Random lights would audibly click off at times. Once I heard a piece of silverware hit the ground in the kitchen. I went to check, and there was a fork sitting on the ground, despite it being in the drying rack with no way to naturally fall that way. Mind you, I am living completely alone and had no one over when these things happen, so share witness to. Months pass, and I'm just used to it at this point. Just tell the ghost to cut it out when something happens. One night around August, the absolute worst experience happened. Laying in bed, slowly drifting to sleep when the air gets very cold, much colder than I keep it and almost thick. Instantly awake and gripped with unbearable dread. Can't move though. Recognize this as sleep paralysis, though different from prior experiences. I feel a finger scratch my heel up to my ankle as more fingers follow. Finally, a whole hand is gripping my lower leg as a second begins crawling up my other leg. Feel my whole body sliding towards the foot of the bed. This whole process was quite slow, and I attempt to scream, "Jesus Christ!" but I can hardly get it out until I successfully yelp his name at whatever is grabbing me. It lets go, but I'm too petrified to look down yet. Still feel the cold air and dark presence in the room. Lay completely still in shock until dawn comes and the light brings a feeling of safety. Takes a minute to get over it and sleep with the light on for a minute, but I eventually moved on. I end up getting a girlfriend, and she moves in with me in October. I tell her my experiences, but she is very skeptical. She starts to believe me though when she sees the doors opening and light switching being fucked with. About a month after she moves in, we're laying in bed cuddling, lights are off, and we're just talking before we fall asleep. The air gets cold like last time, and she instantly goes silent and just stares at me. I feel the presence again, and she starts bawling her eyes out. I look across the room, and in my open closet I see a white face with black eyes just staring at us before vanishing. Apparently she had started crying because she felt a breath on her neck and a touch on her side, which she said felt deathly cold, like putting an ice cube down her shirt. We both get out before something else happens and stay at a friend's place for the night. Her Catholic grandmother comes over the next day and performs a blessing, burning sage, putting holy ointment on the doorways, the whole nine. As soon as it's over, the air in the apartment felt much, much lighter, almost easier to breathe. Never see another door move on its own again. Apparently, after discussing this with my neighbors, the former resident of my apartment was an elderly man who was apparently very rude to everyone and kept to himself. He passed away in the apartment a year before I moved in, a fact I wish I had been told before paying my lease. My next-door neighbor said that she had seen him after he died multiple times in her apartment, wearing a striped prison-like uniform, and attempted to ghost Chris Chan her before. My other neighbor said he saw him too, completely black and wearing a hat. He claims to have fought the ghost and punched him to non-existence, but he was a little cracked out, so I take his account with a pinch of salt.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.